We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Ron Tatum. I'm with Forsyth County. My badge says it's a budget director, but I just got promoted to assistant county manager. But it is definitely my privilege to introduce probably someone that doesn't really need introduction here, Rebecca Troutman. She's with the North Carolina Association of County Commissioners. She's been with the association going into 24th year.
I'm in my 24th year now.
Yeah, so that's a great.
And last, by the way.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. She'll be back. She'll be back. Rebecca serves as our intergovernmental relations director, and she's a registered lobbyist with the North Carolina General Assembly. She, of course, represents counties within interests varying from human services to our finance budget, state and county budgets, to other proposed legislation concerning county governments. Some of the key legislative accomplishments that Rebecca's had since I've been with the county for over 20 years is the county Medicaid swap.
Yay, Medicaid relief.
That Medicaid relief was a blessing to counties, and she also helped deal with the legislation on 2012 legislation regarding health and human services consolidation. And that's a big effort that I know a lot of counties are embarking upon or have already done. And so I would like to turn this on over to Rebecca so she can have as much time as possible to talk about some upcoming legislative updates.
Good. Thank you, Rhonda, and good afternoon to everyone. I know we're in our last session before the reception, last session. I'm going to spend some time when we talked in July, the General Assembly hadn't gone home yet. So I went back to look what I had provided as an update, and it was like, here's what the Senate's recommending, here's what the House is recommending. So I'll talk about kind of what their final outcomes were, particularly to the state budget, some other pieces of legislation that impacts county directly, and then spend a lot of the time looking forward, because as you know, in about a month, they're going to be back in town. Just as a reminder, this was the second year of the biennium. And so it's supposed to be a short session. It was also an election year, as you know. So both the House and Senate leadership pledged, we're going to get in, we're going to get out. It's going to be a very short session, the shortest session ever. Well, by August 20th, they finally left. And it took them 6 weeks into the fiscal year to actually get a budget adopted. And frankly, the acrimony between the House and Senate, it's back to the days when the Democrats were in control and it was a fight between the House and Senate. It's not really a party fight, it's really a chamber fight. And it got pretty, like I said, acrimonious. The budget took forever to get adopted. There were a number of different budget proposals on the table. Even the House said, well, we're going to go home because they were tweaking the second year of the budget, so they really didn't have to do anything. Well, we're going to go home and just pass the bare minimums. They had a mini budget. Finally, all that was set aside, and they finally passed a budget 6 weeks into the fiscal year. And I want to talk about what that looks like in terms of the impacts to counties. The focus really for this session was on education funding. How are we going to increase teacher salaries? And as we know, that impacts our county budgets directly because we supplement, for the most part, all teacher salaries, and we fund a portion of the school personnel as well. So when those salaries change, they impact the appropriations from counties moving forward. But of course, we didn't know that when we had our budgets done by the time the General Assembly finally acted in mid-July. So I'm going to talk real quickly about what it meant. One of our biggest issues was, could we get an increase in the lottery allocations? Because when the lottery was actually enacted in 2005, and frankly, the reason it was enacted, I was there at that time, was in fact the money pledged for school construction. And 40% of net revenues were supposed to go for schools, capital facilities, because we were looking at about a $10 billion deficit in school needs at that time. So for the first 5, 6, 7, 8 years, we received that 40%, and then the recession hit. Bottom dropped out of sales taxes, impacted personal income tax revenues, which is the major source of funding for state government. So the General Assembly, and that was even Democrat controlled at that time, was looking for some solutions. Oh, here's that big pot of money going to counties, capital facilities. Let's use some of that, but pledge that we'll restore it in future years. So that happened starting, I think, about 2009. Since that time, they've level set that appropriation at $100 million, which represents about 20% of net lottery proceeds. So we're about half of what we should be. One of the things also that we want to get restored in language was the 40%, because they pulled that out in last year's budget. Frankly, I think the General Assembly was very confident that, in fact, they want to continue funding public school construction through the $100 million, but they didn't want to return that language because they weren't honoring it, and they didn't want language in statutes that they weren't honoring. So they maintained the $100 million, and frankly, that was a win because all of the additional funding was going to teacher salaries. And there was even discussion, let's take the lottery funds and fund teacher salaries. We were able to keep that at $100 million. But they also put in the special provision that you can no longer pledge it for debt service going forward, because that was the argument we were using. Frankly, this was just to shut us up. We were saying, we have to have the 40%, you can't lower it below $100 million, because our counties have pledged those dollars, and frankly, they told us to back in 2005 to expedite school construction. Our counties have pledged those dollars for debt service. Now, you really can't pledge those dollars. You can pledge either facility if you're doing a GO bond, or you can, a COPS bond, or a full faith and credit if you're doing a GO bond. But we know that, in fact, you're relying on that revenue stream to pay off debt service. So they made it real clear that you couldn't pledge those funds going forward. You can still use the lottery dollars for debt service now and in the future. You just can't pledge them, whatever that means. They really, they just did that to shut us up, so we couldn't use that argument anymore. Lots of focus, and it's going to continue, and I tell you this right now, on child protective services, which I think is the absolutely most important thing county governments do in North Carolina. We had some unfortunate incidents arise in some of our departments of social services. In fact, Rhonda, that's actually pushing a lot of counties to move towards consolidation under that new authority, just to have greater oversight of some of these departments. But the state's paying particularly attention to that. They put some additional monies. You've got additional dollars to hire some CPS workers. There's going to be a great deal more oversight from the state agency, and they're going to do a statewide analysis of what we look like here in North Carolina. So just pay attention. There's going to be a lot more focus on child protective services, perhaps even setting standards for the workers in that program. When we talk the budget, as you know, counties are so integrated with state agencies that whatever they do in the budget or don't do in the budget has huge impacts to county government. In fact, it was really funny. I was just in the League's presentation. They had one slide on the budget, a couple of smaller provisions, special provisions, and that was their entire discussion. I spent most of my time talking about the budget. There were a number of proposals either coming from the House, the Senate, or the governor, because all three of those bodies have their own budget proposals that would have impacted county governments fairly significantly, and we were able to take those out, so we're very happy about that. So what's in, what's out are two important things. Here's one thing they did, looking for money, again, to fund teacher salary increases. Back in 2007, when we had the Medicaid relief, there was such an outcry for counties to be held harmless and benefit from this, that a part of the relief, because you know they took a half cent, so whenever you hear your legislator saying, boy, that was a sweet deal y'all got in 2007, maybe we should revisit that, please remind them that they also took a half penny. And at that point, our Medicaid bill was about $500 million. A half a penny generates about $5.5 million. We had to hold the cities harmless for their loss of that sales taxes. So if you look collectively, it was about even, but if you obviously look individually, Carteret would have lost Wake would have lost Mecklenburg Gaines. So how do you then create a hold harmless formula so everybody is at least held to a net of 0 or greater? But on top of that, they said even for those who didn't benefit by at least $500,000, we will send you a check for $500,000. So that went to the Wakes and the Onslows. Y'all probably got some in Carteret.
500.
It also went, so what it would be, here's your sales tax losses, here are your Medicaid gains. That is tracked annually by the state. You see it in the Medicaid Hold Harmless report. So, is the difference between those two at least $500,000 to your benefit? If not, you get a check, either partially or in the case of Carteret County, fully, because they, or it could have even been higher. I don't know if it was higher.
Last year was higher.
Like Wake County, y'all were here, y'all probably got a check for about $5.5 million, didn't you? Because they have to bring them up to 0 and then give them $500,000. But anyway, what the General Assembly did here is said, okay, everybody's going to be held harmless, nobody's going to lose, but we're going to take away that net benefit of $500,000. So it takes those monies away from kind of those net losers if we didn't have the hold harmless, but it also impacts those smaller counties whereby, you know, I'm thinking that Terrell County got something like $450,000 because, you know, they were a little bit better than Medicaid swap, but not to the $500,000. And $500,000 to Terrell County is a lot of money. It's 9 cents on their tax rate. But anyway, General Assembly looking for any pot of money. They're promising the hold harmless, but they're taking away that $500,000 net guarantee over 4 years by ratcheting it down $125,000 each year. Again, teachers. Another thing they're doing, as you know, way back, I think it was like 3 years ago, they started remanding misdemeanors to county jails and paying you voluntarily for those who liked to house those. Now they're saying all misdemeanors will come down to the county jail still voluntarily and paid out of that statewide misdemeanor confinement fund. So, the biggest thing, what are teacher salaries going to do and how are they going to fund them? The Senate wanted 11%, getting rid of teachers' assistants to pay for it, as well as reining in Medicaid eligibility and making provider service cuts. The House said no, we only had about 3 or 4%, followed by the governor, and they kind of fell in between, but they kept the teachers' assistants largely intact, and that's when you saw them taking away funding from other areas. I mean, most state agencies got cut 1 to 2%. Like I said, they took away the Medicaid hold harmless, that net benefit of $500,000, starting ratcheting that down, all focused again on teachers' salaries. Less money going to teachers' assistants. I think this came from the Senate. It's like, we are not going to fund those positions any more than we have to. And additional money is going to community college and state employees as well. Big issue about what's going to happen with Medicaid, because just like it was eating our lunch back in 2007, it continues to ratchet up for the state government, roughly now a $14 billion program, and they pay about 35 cents on the dollar for that. So all new monies are being consumed by Medicaid, so their focus has been, how can we control that budget? The Senate said, let's cut eligibility. They're going to get rid of, I think, the categorical needy, if I recall, and we're also going to reduce provider rates here in North Carolina. The House said no. One of the things that kept them in session for so long, and I'll talk more about that, was what Medicaid is going to look like going forward in the state, and they are still fighting to this day about that. So if we say postpone to next session, I don't see them ever reaching resolution on that particular issue. Some good things for us. One of the things we've long pushed, and when I say long pushed, we rely on what our counties have told us to be important. Our goals booklet, and that's in the development stage right now, need additional monies for mental health and community services, and they did provide some there. Huge issue with the cities in particular with regards to them sunsetting the historic tax credits and the film credits. One of the things the General Assembly had done from the 2013 Tax Simplification Act was we are going to let those tax credit programs that have a sunset, and most of them do, we're just going to let those sunsets take effect. We're not going to restore them. We're not going to extend them. We have reduced substantially the corporate tax rate. We have reduced substantially the personal income tax rates for those LLCs and other privately held companies. So that's the tax relief we're going to give those companies. We're going to get rid of the tax credits. And so they allow the historic milk credit and historic rehabilitation to sunset along with the film tax credit. Got a lot of discussion at the end of the session. They also, instead, what they're doing, rather than having tax credits, they will have targeted appropriations to specific industries. So they set aside $10 million for the film industry to take to replace that tax credit that expires at the end of this calendar year. But they also wanted to increase, again, money put on the table when you're closing an economic development deal. So they set aside $20 million for a new job catalyst program, similar to the one NC fund that we're familiar with. However, its spending authority was embedded in a bill that actually failed at the last minute. I'll talk more about that. So that pot of money is just sitting there and they can't spend it because they don't have the authority to do so. And here is the bill that had the authority for that job catalyst fund that died at the very end. It was a surprise. So we got a call from Senate Finance that they had a deal for us. They're going to have new sales taxing authority for counties. It's like, yes, we want to hear that. So we got over there and they said, you know that quarter-cent sales tax we gave you in that Medicaid swap? Oh, yes, we're very familiar with that. We're going to take that away, but give you the ability to enact a quarter-cent for education purposes only. And we said, well, let's think about that, because a lot of our counties are using that quarter-cent, Article 46, for school construction, but a number of counties are using them for other purposes. And I raised the issue with Alexander County, who was under a court mandate to build a new jail, and that's how they financed that new jail. And they said, oh, well, that's interesting. And they said, also, we're going to put a cap on your sales tax rate. Well, we already have a cap. It's not stated as such, but we can't go above the authority that's already been granted to the General Assembly until we get new authority. So in essence, I think we already have a cap. But they were really targeting Mecklenburg and Wake, who had some additional authority in transit and the quarter-cent that would take them over that cap. Well, they were grandfathering in Orange and Durham under this new cap, but they said if Mecklenburg and Wake don't pass those referenda that would take them up to 2 3/4, they lose that authority. And of course, that's a huge issue for Wake and Mecklenburg. We got them to, extend it and back it out. Then all of a sudden, this bill became the Christmas tree bill. All of the tax incentives, the tax credit programs, some technical corrections that was desperately needed by the telecom industry. Then there was a fix needed to the teachers' assistant salaries. They kind of screwed it up in the budget and they wanted to fix it in this bill. All sorts of things were labeled all into this bill. We were able to kind of fix most of the sales tax thing. The House just chose not to concur. It really was a number of the House members who are totally against tax incentives going out to businesses, and that kind of took it down, so the House failed to concur on that and kept a lot of stuff from moving forward. We always like to see where we are at the end of the session based on our goals booklet. I think we had a lot of success in terms of, I think we had 55 goals if I recall, moving forward, so that was good. Happy about that. I want to talk about some specific legislation unless there's any questions about budget. Because one other thing I want to talk about was this anti-pension spiking legislation that was enacted, again, in the waning days of the General Assembly. The League and the Association actually worked with the Retirement Division and the City County Manager's Retirement Committee to craft this bill. We thought we needed to be proactive in terms of eliminating or at least discouraging those very high profile, albeit rare occurrences of pension spiking. And what we're talking about there are our executives, presidents of community colleges, superintendents of school systems. At the very last year of their careers, they'll get this huge bump in salary, or their governing board will convert housing allowances and travel allowances into salaries, which is a big no-no. They're not supposed to be doing it, but they do. So all of a sudden, they have this huge bump moving forward in their retirement. Their pension is higher, but they have not financed that through their actuarial contributions, either the employer or the employee. So that's what this was really aiming at. It doesn't eliminate pension spiking, but what it does is require the offending agency for vested employees and or the employee for new employees to pay the actuarial cost, or for the new employee actually having a pension cap going forward. So it's a formula embedded in the law. It's not anybody who makes over $100,000 is going to get caught up in it. That just puts you in the pot to be tested. So the retirement division is going to look at all of the employees, state and local, who make over $100,000, watch any increases in salary, see how close they are to retirement, and notify our local governments and state agencies that there might be a problem. Now the problem with that, we in fact demanded that notification to happen, because then Carter Rep might want to go back and rescind that salary, or do a little side deal where you'll have to help us pay for that actuarial cost, or we're going to have to rescind that salary. It's going to be a public record, and I promise you, the News and Observer will be looking for those reports each month. Okay? So, what if in case, so those are possible, and it really depends on when that employee chooses to retire. So what if in case there is pension spiking? That in fact, over $100,000, huge bump in salary, so they get caught up in pension spiking. The local government's going to be notified of that, and they will have to pay that for existing employees. Okay? For new hires, and this becomes effective January 1, for new hires, it will be the employee's responsibility. They can share it with the employer, or they can have their pension actually capped moving forward. Any questions there? Big emphasis right now on infrastructure, and I think this bill right here kind of shows that focus going forward. There's going to be a blue ribbon committee established to investigate infrastructure needs, counties' needs, particularly with schools, administrative buildings, also in water and sewer, and also looking at, is there an appropriate dedicated funding stream moving forward for the absolute backlog we have at county, city, and state governments in terms of infrastructure. So I think we'll see more of that going forward. This one is not so good. As you know, last year they did this huge change in our election laws, that's the voter ID, changing the number of days open for early voting, all of that was done last year. Whenever they do something that big, they have to come back the following year and tweak it. And that's what this did. It clarified some of those changes. But on the House floor, there was an amendment offered up by a representative who was just defeated. But this moves forward that limits your ability, and for counties it's particularly important, limits your ability about when you can hold referenda for either bonds or that Article 46 sales tax or the transit tax that's still out there, Article 43. So now you can only do it in an election year with, on even years with your county commissioners, presidential election, and of course General Assembly members. Y'all may recall I came and talked to y'all, I think in the summer, about the Union County mediation lawsuit where their Board of Education, I think this was the fourth time in maybe 5 years, suing the county on lack of sufficiency for appropriations going to public schools from the county to the Union County School Board. And there was a decision coming out of the courts that okay, Union County, not only do you owe them what they asked for, but you owe them 10 times more than what they asked for, okay? Because they had asked for, I think, like $8 million in capital. Now, let's remember that Union County, sitting right there beside Charlotte, has had rapid growth, student population. They've got a large debt per capita because of building schools. So we're just talking about the capital outlay appropriation. And the schools that asked for $8 million, the county said, we can't do that any one year, but over 3 years, we'll give you $3 million, we'll make it $9 million. And that wasn't enough, so they sued the county commissioners, and that's when the court said, you know that $8 million, we're making $81 million. Because they then brought in information, this wasn't even asked by the school boards, about leaky roofs and such like that. Clearly, this is a court case that has major repercussions to all of us. In fact, I think that emboldened a lot of your school districts this past year to threaten mediation, threaten that lawsuit, because I heard a number of cases where that happened. So, not surprisingly, the association filed an amicus brief. They just had the hearing on that last week, and we should have a decision in the next month to see what happens with that court case. Well, the Union County delegation, the General Assembly, wasn't too happy about what happened. I think it would raise their property taxes by 45 cents in one fell swoop to actually pay that bill. So we were working with Senator Tupper on House Bill 292. I think it was actually a bill that was changing to something else, to do a moratorium statewide so school districts could not sue their boards of county commissioners over self-sufficiency, over sufficient funding. The Senate leadership said, no, you're going to have to limit it. We got it passed, and it applies to Union County, but also to Gaston and Nash as well. I imagine when our goals process moves forward, we have a similar goal, looking at getting rid of what is rather an obsolete statutory provision that allows them to sue on sufficiency of funding. Frankly, that was put in place in the 20s when the only funding for school systems was coming from the county pockets. So perhaps at that time it would make sense, but they are the only independent body that is statutorily permitted to sue another independent body over sufficiency. So we wouldn't be taking over their right to sue, like couldn't take away my right to sue, but around this statute just in terms of sufficiency. Good thing here, heard a lot from our county finance officers about the E-Verify, the new requirements on contractors and subcontractors that was put in place the year before. I think they inadvertently applied it to all purchases. We've now got it narrowed and more in line with the school districts and some of the other special district authorities under your command. More aligned with that, we're only looking at the major construction contracts moving forward. Questions, comments? As I mentioned, the Tax Simplification Act back in 2013, major change, you have to come back and make tweaks to it, and 1050 did just that. Focus, unfortunately, to the cities and repealed their ability to levy privilege license going forward and did nothing for replacements. There were some versions initially that would say on any businesses you could levy up to $100, because it really was a purpose of identifying what businesses were in your community. It wasn't a regulatory tax. That never moved forward, so there's a lot of discussion. How are they going to avoid that fiscal cliff of roughly $60 million moving forward? So that took care of that. Very little impact to us. It repealed our ability to levy privilege license. Statewide, we were less than $350,000, and basically the only thing we could levy privilege license on were kind of dog and pony shows. However, 1050 also hurt us by setting in perpetuity the license plate agency's fees to collect property taxes on our behalf. The $1.06 was temporary as they got their infrastructure up. Now it's been made permanent. One of our goals was actually enacted in 1050, and no longer your tax agencies have to do the valuation and appraisal of wireless facilities moving forward. That's all going to be done by Department of Revenue. Big change in economic development. You've probably heard the announcement that we're going to have a new Secretary of Commerce, and we now have a new Director of the Public-Private Partnership. But what House Bill 1031 put in place the structure for setting up that public-private partnership moving forward. Even though there was some discussion in the session prior to that, they never enacted that legislation. The General Assembly still wants to move forward with regulatory reform. The House particularly had some requirements that would be extremely onerous and I think kind of mean-spirited to local governments. Most of that was pushed back and only a few things moving forward in terms of that. Big discussion now on fracking. The Energy Modernization Act now permits fracking to move forward once all of the rules are adopted. And as you know, there's discussion now that the Mining and Energy Commission is doing just that. So we anticipate that moving forward. It does preempt local governments from enacting any ordinances that would prevent fracking. But it is not going to take your ability away of taxing the infrastructure around fracking. And in fact, David Baker with the Department of Revenue's group has been tasked to evaluate how the mineral rights should actually be taxed under tangible property. So he has developed some concepts. In fact, we're going to meet with him next week to see what that's going to look like. Y'all may recall that this bill, one of its versions, would have put a property tax cap, I think limiting the increase in value in any 1 year. I think it was either 6 or 8%. When we went and talked to the bill sponsors, oh, that just applies to Lee and Moore because they're going to have this huge windfall because of fracking. And we pointed out the constitutionality implications that you can't change property valuations for just 1 or 2 counties. In fact, the Constitution requires that across the board. They said, oh. And so that has changed fairly quickly. That's what that bill was. And finally, what we're hearing right now, particularly from our neighbor to, let's see, more, I guess we'd be to the south, I mean to the northeast, is coal ash. And that was another thing that kept the General Assembly in session, fighting between the House and Senate, which version would come out of that. Again, preempts local governments. There is no question that they will continue to do that because they feel like this is a statewide matter that has to be taken into account under statewide regulation. So individual local governments prohibiting that statewide regulation is going to be problematic, and that's why they've taken away our ability to regulate coal ash. And now what's happening in Lee County right now, Duke Power is saying we're going to take some of the coal ash out of New Hanover and Rockingham, I think, are the 2 places having to come out immediately, and we're going to put them in clay mines. And the county is protesting. That, in essence, is a landfill, and we're not getting any monetary replacement funds for the damage of bringing that into our community. And I know that's an issue in Wake as well, Rebecca, because y'all have some of those clay mines right at the border of Lee and Wake. So stay tuned for that. Okay, the biggest thing that kept them in session was what are we going to do with Medicaid reform? Are we going to outsource it, straight out managed care from private companies coming out of state, capitated service levels? So we give these providers, we offset all the risks, state budget risk to these providers. We give them a set amount, and they have to manage the Medicaid community under that amount, just like we do with our LMEs, MCOs for mental health. But this is largely, could it be done with private companies? That's what the Senate wanted. The House said, no, 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 no. We have Community Care of North Carolina here in North Carolina. It's a nationally recognized model of providers having a medical home. Let's use this accountable care organization instead, moving forward with Medicaid reform. We can still move to the capitated model, but perhaps not for all Medicaid clients. So they both just dug in. They don't know what the structure is going to look like. They have had 2 subcommittees, different subcommittees on the Program Evaluation Division looking at the structure, and Health and Human Services Legislative Oversight looking at the program to come up with some resolution to inform the long session. Well, what happened this week at the LOC, HHS LOC, they took the subcommittee report that recommended managed care along with accountable care organizations to have a capitated model in place within 3 years. They added the words "if feasible," meaning there's no way we're going to do it in 3 years. And so that was moving forward, and they got it to the main committee, and they just stripped out all that language. So again, the House and Senate are absolutely juggernauts about what's going to happen with Medicaid reform. We're watching this because this is going to set the stage for the discussion, the renewed discussion around Medicaid expansion. They will not do anything until this is fixed, and I do not see this being fixed anytime soon. Okay, let's look forward and talking about how we're doing our agenda. It's very comprehensive, and what comes out of it is this goals package moving forward. So all of our counties are invited to submit goals through the process. That's through July through September. They're then vetted through our 7 steering committees based on subject matter, education, health and human services, tax and finance. Then those goals coming out of the steering committees go to a kind of larger committee representing those committees of matter. And then they vet it further, going to our board of directors, but then back to our members. In fact, you will receive in your county a booklet that looks like this. It just went out yesterday, showing the 44 recommended goals coming through this process for your boards to choose a voting delegate to come in mid-January back here and vote on the final package and prioritize that to turn into this package moving forward for the biennium. So that's where we are. Number of 358 goals submitted by, I think we had 68 counties and 2 affiliates. 44 remained in the packet. A lot of them were similar or duplicate goals. And I want to talk about the ones around tax and finance because that may be of the greatest interest to y'all. I was astonished with the number of goals around economic development. I had like 110 tax and finance goals in my committee. If you collapse them and get rid of the duplicates and such like that, there were like 55. Almost half of those had to do with economic development. That the rural counties being concerned, being left out in terms of infrastructure and grant funding and technical assistance, now that they've basically done away with the rural center, substituted the Division of Rural Infrastructure Development in the Department of Commerce, taken away the funds that would normally flow to the Golden Leaf Foundation, concerned about how counties fit into this new model. Here we have this public-private partnership that's going to do the recruitment and the retention. What's the county role in that moving forward? So lots of concerns going forward. Also, a lot of the goals about we want to make sure that the taxing authority we have in place now, particularly in our property tax base, is not continually eroded. And so that was one of the goals and kind of the focus of the goals as well. So for the top 5 tax and finance going forward, here's kind of where they're focused on. We don't want any more mandates. And that's actually a goal that is perpetual for the most part. But here's the goal around economic development. So we want it general to be able to give the advocates, the lobbyists, to maneuver in the discussions around economic development. But then they were very specific about we want some additional incentives to match the needs that we have in our particular communities. Let's revisit film tax credit. Let's revisit historic preservation. And let's increase infrastructure going in, particularly in the rural areas, to help them compete economically moving forward. So, some other goals. We're going to continue to oppose roads. We don't want to have that shifted to counties. Because of that change in the Medicaid net benefit, it's like, let's just get out real front and say we oppose any Medicaid cost shifting back to counties. I cannot tell you, there's not a day I go by talking to members of the General Assembly where they remind us of that deal and say, maybe we can give you back Medicaid. Whenever we ask for anything else, okay, fine, maybe we can give you back Medicaid. So this will be real clear, but we oppose that. And also encourage more broadband opportunities. There's a number of goals around, particularly in our rural areas, because you don't have the density out there to attract the telco infrastructure development. What can we do as counties to kind of spur development of those facilities? Give us our lottery monies back. The Library Association did a tremendous job in lobbying their county commissioners. I think I had 40 goals on increasing library funding. And here's going to be, I think, the one that generates the most conversation, and it did in our legislative goals and in our board meeting, and that is us supporting publicly Medicaid expansion. So I think that's going to generate the most discussion at our legislative goals conference. It certainly did in the 3 stops that this goal has made thus far. But again, I think all that's going to be tied up to where the state's going to go in terms of Medicaid structure, who's going to be eligible, and the services that are eligible in North Carolina before any of that is actually going to be contemplated. So let's look towards some statewide issues. First of all, I want to talk real quickly about what the Leader's pension fund looks like. Because Jennifer's already emailed me, hey, what's my retirement rate going to be like? And I was trying to hedge. I'm going to have to hedge because we're doing so well. We have the ability now to stabilize the system moving forward. And I think we want to take advantage of that. And you've heard all about the changes in the GASB ruling, requirements in terms of reporting pensions individually. Good news there, you're going to be reporting an asset and not a deficit. And we're probably the only local government fund in the nation that's going to actually be reporting an asset, not a deficit. So that's good news. Our 7.07 local government employee retirement contribution will fall. We just don't know how much. And the reason we don't know how much, and that decision will be made next month by the Board of Trustees of the Leaders Fund, the local government employees retirement system, Leaders, is because we have the opportunity now to go back to where things used to be before the crash of the stock market in 2008. And that is to level set a rate that you can rely on for the next 5 years. And it's going to be done in concert with what's called the experience study that looks out a much more comprehensive look at salary increases and the demographics of the population that's going to be coming into the retirement system to inform the actuarial costs moving forward. So let's from now on set a 5-year rate along with that experience study. That won't be done until 2016, so that'll be 2016-17, because that's when the next experience study is done. But if we don't drop the ARC to the level that we can drop it at, and I'll show you what that looks like. Now, this is hard to say. So here's what we are, 707, we've been there for 2 years. We have the ability to actually drop to 6.52%. That's the actuarial requirement, but a part of that is investment gains. So it would allow roughly a 0.625% COLA. I think the Leader Board's going to do that for sure, since we took away the 1% last year. But we have the ability to set it kind of in between and then set a 5-year rate moving forward so you don't have these ups and downs that we've experienced since the stock market crash. So, go ahead, Rebecca.
Will Leo change also, or is it just?
Yes, no, the Leo will follow suit. I think it's like, what is it, about 30 basis points higher or something like that. It will follow suit too. So if we maintain, if the stock market doesn't crash this month and we maintain 7.25%, this is kind of what it looks like in the out years. I would love to get 6% employee, 6% employer. The retirement division says, I'm not sure we'll ever get there, but at least we can stabilize the rate moving forward so you'll have more of an understanding of what your retirement benefit for your employees will be moving forward. So we won't know that, Jennifer, until the 15th of January. I'm guessing they're going to settle probably about 675, something like that. So we'll see a drop, not all the way, a little bit of a COLA. The employees, the retirees haven't had a COLA since 2008, and then it was like 0.1%. So I think that's going to go forward. In fact, our board took action last week on that to support those things coming from recommendations from the retirement committee to set the rate so it allows that 5-year arc moving forward, to support the COLA based on investment gains only. Okay, the retirees will be looking for a 1%, 2%. The investment gains, and that's the only thing the Leaders Board is able to grant, is what the investment gains are. Otherwise, it has to go to the General Assembly. That's what they tried to do last year. We were able to stop them from doing that. And also, working to define the 1,000-hour rule. And the 1,000-hour rule has some certain components. It defines who is to be counted in the retirement system. So if you have a part-time employee that works less than 1,000 hours, you don't have to contribute, they don't have to contribute. But if you do have a part-time regular employee, so it's going to define what a regular employee is, you do have to contribute and they have to contribute as well. It's going to help define and take care of the problem we're having now with regards to when do you start the count. And it's going to start in January, counting those 1,000 hours, along with all of the other personnel records that you start in January. And it's also going to define what a temporary worker is. All of this is kind of in rules right now, but this is going to be in statute. And finally, it's going to provide some exemptions from statutorily required positions like county manager, city manager, those that are statutorily required. Now, that doesn't mean your retired county manager can come back and work, because they're still going to be under the salary cap. They still can only get 50% of post-retirement salary. But it is going to take care and more further define what that looks like. So we anticipate that going forward. Okay, let's jump to the state economy. Huge change last year in the personal income tax structure, and greatly lowered the rates. As we all know, we enjoy lower state taxes. Well, it's coming home to rest. Some of the shortfall, $450 million last year. So far, we're looking at $178 million this year. This is partially due to that tax reform. So here's my real concern as we move forward in the General Assembly, because we won't have a budget, because you'll have to set the 2-year budget again. So what is the revenue stream going to look like, especially as we're asking for additional lottery dollars and some other funding priorities? What is the state budget going to look like? Because right now they're kind of on the downward swing. Now, this is coming from Barry Boardman, the chief economist of the General Assembly. Good news here, very little change with regards to their forecast, because they make forecast in April, they go back and refresh it in October. So we're not looking too badly, and sales taxes are booming. I'm hearing from some of y'all it's not booming in my area, but collectively, we just got the distribution numbers for December. Year to date, after the first 3 months, we're up nearly 9% in money going to you. Now, always the bugaboo, I don't know when your refunds are hitting, okay? I don't know when that's going to happen. I don't know how it's going to change that dynamic, okay? But I know that money's going out collectively to counties and cities are up nearly 9% after 3 months. A lot of money. But, so we're back to about the 5% growth, year over year. But here's one thing Barry wants to point out. During the boom, the housing boom, where you had huge sales tax collections on construction materials and the things that go into new houses like furniture, you saw a per capita collection jump significantly. We're not going to return to the boom years. We're going to stay kind of at this level. So we're not going to see the rapid growth that we experienced in the growth of the 2000s moving forward. It's going to be moderate growth that we experienced prior to that. So don't go spend it all now. Okay, so I mentioned we are going to be looking at creating a new state budget, because the authority for spending will expire at the end of this fiscal year. And of course, the governor will be the first out with his proposal. We've already had conversations with his new Budget Director Lee Roberts, who's Cookie Roberts' son, by the way, I think it's kind of interesting. And he says that the governor's budget is going to be out in late February. That's very early. And the reason it's early because what undergirds the expenditures are the forecasted revenues. And that has to be a consensus forecast with the General Assembly. So that has to be done by mid-February. Well, what doesn't happen until April 15th? That's when they get all their money. That's when they'll know what are the consequences of changing the tax structure so dramatically. So even if you have the governor's budget out, and then we have an April surprise that's an unfortunate surprise, all bets are off. We don't know what that's going to look like. Now, where's his priorities going to be? He's already talked about need for infrastructure. So there could be he could be pushing for a statewide bond on infrastructure. It'll be interesting to see what Treasurer Cowell says on Friday. In February, she has a debt affordability committee that always presents the state's ability to incur debt, and it's been growing over time. So it'll be interesting to see if she talks about that, but he's already put that out there. He's already talking, as is Secretary Bosch of the Department of Health and Human Services, should we consider Medicaid expansion? Because they're leaving a lot of federal dollars on the table, and particularly in the rural hospitals, they've been really pushing because the uninsured clientele still have to be taken care of in emergency departments. They cannot be turned away, federal law, okay? And again, as I mentioned, the big unknown is what are the state revenues, what's the revenue picture going to look like in April? So, big change, as you know, we now have former House Speaker Tillis, who's going to be one of our senators, inducted in the Senate in January. So who's going to be taking his place? And there's a big scramble, and there were at least 6 House members vying for this, because this really sets the tone not only on the House floor, but also in the Republican caucus in the House caucus. So they voted 2 weeks ago, and Tim Moore is the presumed Speaker of the House. They actually have to confirm that at their organizational session January 14th. And he has already picked his lieutenants. David Lewis, who was frankly the architect of the Tax Reform Simplification Act in 2013 from Harnett County Plus 5, and Representative Mike Hager will be Majority Leader. So some of the current people, Tim Moore was former Rules Chair, but Mike Hager was not the Majority Leader. So some changing seats. We don't know who the committee chairs are going to be, who the appropriations chair is going to be. We don't know where the Speaker feels about Medicaid expansion. He's already said that's probably not going to happen. We don't know how he feels about infrastructure or any of the other issues facing the General Assembly moving forward. So you've heard. Senator Rucho has come out saying we are going to take sales taxes and no longer do 2/3, 3/4 on a point of sale basis and 1/4 on per capita. We're going to do it all per capita to help our rural counties. So that would impact everybody in this room. Generally, for the most part, you get much more money on a point of delivery basis than per capita. We've already had conversations with him. We're going to do some brainstorming because when they said, hey, bring us your ideas, what we want to do is bring something that helps all of our counties and hurts none of our counties. That's kind of the basic principle we operate under. He wants to expand sales tax services. We've generally been supportive of that because once the sales tax base is expanded and the county rates apply to that, that's not going to offset losses if it changes the allocation. And frankly, they're also talking about some replacement revenues for the loss of the municipal privilege license tax. Because there's been some discussion, well, you know, the cities only get 30% of the sales taxes. Well, they get that on a statewide average. You know, they don't understand that you have to go look individually at each county area. I mean, Hyde County gets 100% of theirs because they don't have a town. So you're gonna, if you gave them more, the cities more, who would you give it to? Because there's not a city there to receive it. So I don't think they understand the intricacies of sales taxes. And also, really, what are they going to do with Medicaid reform? Are they going to reach agreement? Every indication is right now, again, the House and Senate are just, oh, they're fisticuffs. It gets so. Did you see the words yesterday that Nelson Dollar was deliberately sabotaging the recommendations from the subcommittee, and with that, the expansions going forward. So, I think I'm done right on time. We got 5 minutes for questions, comments. What's happening in y'all's area? I know y'all gonna have a budget discussion about trends. How do y'all sales taxes look? I know is Cumberland here today? I know they're having actually a drop in receipts, and I think it's obviously focused on the military community. Onslow, are y'all here?
Carteret's up 9%.
Wow, so you're right at the state average then. What about others?
We're at 5.2, but we're one of the counties that our first month was really heavily hit with the refunds.
Your first month was?
Very
Well,
heavily.
good. So maybe that's behind you. I would say that's good news, because at least, and I can't tell y'all enough, emphasize enough, track those refunds. See when they hit, make sure that they are done appropriately. You can get that information from the Department of Revenue. So it's going to be your hospitals and your universities, large nonprofits, but it's really the hospitals.
Oh, quick question about getting the list of the refunds. Do we have to submit that letter annually, or is once it's on file, they just
I
automatically
think once
send
it's
it?
on file, they honor that deed.
Okay.
And we're working with the Department of Revenue and David Baker to make that information more readily available. It does have some confidentiality limitations along with any other revenues from private companies. Keith?
I've said this before to the group, but I think it's extraordinarily important that we start getting more information from DORs related to sales tax. I know there are places on the website where you can get the type of sales for the county for the whole year, but there's nowhere you can get the type of sales like clothing or groupings that the state has by month. To be sure, they collect it by month because they give me a summary total of Durham County for the year, and that would help us see changes in types of things being charged. I'm sure they collect an infinite amount more information that they provide to us on the website.
Well, if somebody could give me a list of the information that y'all need, you can certainly take it to the Department of Revenue. One thing I will say, that they are limited in the ability to parse the data because you could get to be so granular that it identifies the retailer, and that is a big no-no. So there may be some hesitancy there, Keith, but if I could get the listing of things that y'all need, we can certainly work with data.
I just want you to think, there's value in knowing if you put something in a certain place, seeing the sales tax effect around something, be it a park, be it some sort of economic development. There are other states that do have that level of information where you can almost go down to the street level, even if it's not the actual company, but it is, this is what's happening in this block.
Right. There's just huge confidentiality issues with the private companies, and I don't see the General Assembly changing that anytime soon.
Yeah, so one question I had, and it may be the confidentiality issue, is how much of what we're seeing now in sales tax growth is tied to services and how much is tied to the internet sales? Is there a way to then narrow that down?
Well, one of the things when, Amazon's now collecting on our behalf, and the reason they're doing this is because they're actually having physical presence in the state. And research estimated it would be roughly $10 to $12 million annually for local governments. We get about $1 million more for that. So you get a little bit of bump there. I think what Barry's seeing is just kind of an uptick in sales overall, if that helps. We can see, and I can talk to Barry and David if we can get a better understanding of what markets are actually accelerating. I'll be glad to do that.
Yeah, it's one thing to get 6% growth in the year you're in, but it's another thing to not know what the hell's going on to make that number. And so you're not going to use 6% for the next year, or at least I'm not. But
unless you know what's happening.
Right, and what's driving it?
Some of it would be from the expansion that they had.
Yeah, there wasn't that
wasn't a
much.
whole lot,
Yeah, once it's fully implemented, I think it goes out to 2018, Rhonda. I had estimated, I think it was about $30 million extra dollars, but $30 million of $2 billion is not very much, but there is a little bit. And for those of you that have universities where the dining hall food is now gonna be taxed, I think you'll see an uptick. I think that will uptick it enough that you can probably see some changes.
Back on the mental health front, you know, they're talking about consolidating all these LOBs.
Yeah, I should have put that
How
slide.
does that impact counties and what will they still have that contribution requirement of what we have now?
There is still, on statute, Ron is talking about, you've got, I think we're down to 10 LMEs, because 2 of them are just in the process of consolidating. The General Assembly and the Department of Health and Human Services expect further consolidation down to 4 major regional LMEs, MCOs. That is not happening as quickly as they anticipated, and I understand in a lot of areas, Forsyth County being one of them, Wake being one against Guilford, is that the marriages are not being they're not very happy. They're more like shotgun weddings right now that are happening. Now, there's nothing in law that forces that. I think there's expectations that they move and consolidate that. County-made effort is still there. It hasn't changed. I haven't had a big hue and cry to change it. Frankly, it's the larger counties that we spend only about $130 million for mental health statewide, and I would say probably, Wake and Mecklenburg would probably be half of that by themselves. So I haven't had a hue and cry to change that. One of the things that I've tried to prevent is using that as a measure to have a voice in the system. Because a lot of people say, well, there's no reason to have a county commissioner on the board or part of the advisory board if they're not, funding at a certain per capita level. It's like, no, that's not why they're there. They're there really to represent the community interest. So I didn't even have it as a goal to get rid of the maintenance of effort this year. Other questions? It looks like we're out of time. Any other questions?
No, just a comment. I was late coming in, so it may have already been mentioned, but I know this is your last update to us for conference. So
thank you. It is my last
thank you so
one.
much for your years of service.
I feel quite akin to this group because I was one of the founding members 25 years ago when I worked for Wake County. So, Godspeed.
We'll miss you.
Well, next,